Item number 13 could be a long debate, but we've had many debates on this. That's not to say that people don't have the right to make the comments that they feel appropriate, but this is about adopting a statement of proposal to put out for public consultation, and we are on a time frame now. The current bylaw runs out before the next election, and if we haven't adopted an alternative freedom camping in vehicles bylaw, then we will have no bylaw and no controls. So if we could maybe keep that in the back of our mind. Introducing the, well, first of all, I might just get somebody to move and second the recommendations.
I'll move it, Mr. Chair. Linda Cooper.
Linda Cooper to move. A seconder, please.
I'll second.
Okay, Angela Dalton. Right. I'll now, we've got from our officers, Katarina Maki, who I'll invite to speak in a moment. She's being supported by Paul Wilson, Adrian Wilson, Katie Bexley, and Jessica Johnston. So, Katarina, if you'd like to introduce the item, and then we'll go through questions and comments.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou, Mr. Mayor and councillors. I'll briefly introduce this item and of course coordinate any questions you have to our other staff who are here in support. So the key decisions requested today are to adopt a statement of proposal for public consultation and to appoint a bylaw panel. The draft bylaw is being made under the Freedom Camping Act and its specific legislative purpose, intent and requirements. It is the Freedom Camping Act itself which allows freedom camping in the Auckland area and in the rest of New Zealand. The statement of proposal and draft bylaw have been prepared in accordance with statutory requirements. So we've made sure that it's authorised by statute, that it's not unreasonable, that it's not repugnant to other legislation, and that it doesn't give rise to implications or inconsistencies with the New Zealand Bill of Rights. We've also followed the Freedom Camping Act criteria to prohibit or restrict camping, to protect sensitive areas and to manage impacts on public health, safety and access. And we've also worked to ensure and look at whether the cumulative impact of decision making does not in fact cause an effective ban. The statement of proposal implements governing body decisions made in March and May of this year, and it was at the March meeting of the governing body where the substantive decisions about the scope and approach of this draft bylaw were made. It was at that meeting where the August 2019 resolutions of governing body that looked to see whether you could prohibit freedom camping on roads and in residential areas, and where you asked for staff advice on whether this was possible. That was considered at that point in time. Staff provided advice in public, and legally privileged advice was provided to the governing body in confidence. And it was the cumulative advice from that March meeting that led to what you see today. And the May meeting is where options for a general rule and agreement about preferred settings were made. So it's these decisions that form the basis of the draft bylaw and statement proposal before you today. And the key elements of the proposal are to continue to manage reserves under the Reserves Act, to protect and maintain their existing environmental and recreational values, the scheduling of prohibited areas, currently 45, and restricted areas, currently 22, and agreeing the preferred settings for a general rule for non-reserve parks and open spaces and road areas, which is that all freedom camping would be self-contained, be of a 2-night maximum, a leaving time of 9 a.m. and a 2-week return period. These are summarised in the table under paragraph 33, and at the May meeting, There was some debate around whether a 1-night or 2-night maximum stay was required. And in response to that debate, staff were asked that the full options considered for the general rule settings be included in the statement of proposal, and staff have implemented this. Those full options are contained on page 182 to 83 of the agenda report. Local board views were sought on the proposed statement of proposal and the draft bylaw in August. 21 local boards made resolutions. Their resolutions in full, and the staff response is in attachment B, and additional information or tabled items is in attachment C. Of the 21 local boards, 12 supported, but 10 of those were with concerns and requested changes. 6 supported in part, also with concerns and requested changes, and 3 did not support. Whilst the full details of each individual local board are in the attachments, overall there were real concerns about current enforcement resource and requests for increases in that enforcement resource, concerns about whether the draft bylaw is managing the impacts enough. There were requests to add prohibited sites and requests to prohibit entire areas. There was real concern around freedom camping on roads. And 2 local boards expressed concern over the exclusion of reserves, as they wanted to add some reserves because they believe they are better freedom camping sites, and that would help increase visitors and support the local economy. There are risks with adopting the statement of proposal for public consultation. This is a topic that brings out strong views, concerns and advocacy, and also ideas about other ways to do things. Many members of the Auckland community will have an in-principle concern with the permissive nature of the Freedom Camping Act and the criteria it has in terms of whether you can prohibit or restrict things. There will be concerns expressed around the impacts on the community and whether the bylaw goes far enough to manage those impacts. There will also be in-principle concerns to maintain the right to freedom camp in accordance with the Act, and perhaps a belief or perception about the cumulative impact of council decisions being an effective ban. So those key risks are summarised in the table in paragraph 69. We receive a lot of concerns in the previous public engagement and from local boards about the level of compliance and enforcement resource, and there may be really increased public expectations about what can be delivered within existing resource and service levels. I note that governing body requested for information from staff about options to increase compliance, and so that has been presented in the table at paragraph 46. We still have the ongoing issue around knowledge to implement the bylaw in terms of identifying parks that are held under the Local Government Act and parks that are held under the Reserves Act. This process is reliant on information that Council currently holds. It is not complete, and other areas of Council are trying to improve that, and we've included the detail about that in paragraph 48 and 52. I would note that this issue has been flagged through every agenda report that we have presented to governing body to date. If the statement of proposal is approved, we plan to do public consultation between the 18th of October and the 28th of November. And the type of public consultation that will be undertaken will be tailored to the alert level at the time. Thank you. That's all we have. And any questions?
Thank you very much, Katarina. Before we move to questions, there's just a couple of points that I want to make that might prevent unnecessary comment or debate. The first is that you've all been circulated with a response from our legal people in terms of threatened legal action for judicial review. And I just want to emphasise that the legal advice that I have is that there is no legal impediment to governing body approving this draft bylaw for public consultation. Obviously, in public, we will not be talking about proposed legal action. That would not be appropriate. I've mentioned before that we really need to get this going. It's not, I know there's been some discussion that, we need more time to consult, etc. We have worked on this now for over a couple of years, and we have to have the new bylaw in place. Otherwise, there will be no freedom camping bylaw by October next year. The third thing I want to make is that this is a controversial issue. I'm telling you nothing. There are those that want to restrict further. There are those that want to free up further. What is important to us is not to try to make everybody happy, because we won't be able to do that, but to mitigate the risk of successful legal challenge by ensuring that any bylaw that we make under the Act is lawful and reasonable, and that has to guide our decision making today. So with just those things built around it, perhaps I can just raise at this point too, I've received a proposed amendment from Councillor John Watson. Thanks for sending us that, John. The advice I've got is that that cannot be accepted as an amendment because it's revoking a decision that was made back at the May governing body. And if you want to revoke a previous decision, there needs to be notice and there needs to be a report back on that. So my advice is that I'm unable to accept that recommendation. The recommendation was to limit it to one night instead of two, but obviously to make the point that while we've got 2 nights out there, this is a consultation process, and people may well say it should be 1 night or it should be 3 nights or whatever, and then we can make a decision on the balance of the evidence when this comes back to us. Questions. I have the first question in the name of Desley Simpson.
Thanks, Your Worship, and thanks for highlighting those key points at the beginning. Look, I have 3 hopefully quick questions. My first is in relation to the risks on issue point 69. But I want to read it in a different way. So are you saying, because my understanding is a lot of local boards have sent emails through during this meeting, and in fact my own local board has got a resolved issue that isn't part of this paper, but is it true that council could consider increasing the number of restricted areas following consultation? Because in 69 it says the proposed bylaw would enable freedom campers to set 2 nights above a substantive general rule. Council could consider increasing the number of designated restricted areas following consultation. So I'm just getting your confirmation, because my local board has resolved, and it's not in this paper, that they would like to include parts of Tamaki Drive to prohibit freedom camping. And they have mentioned Okahu Bay under cultural significance, Mission Bay because of the hindrance to commercial activity, and Kohi and St Heliers Beach because of related to business areas as well, and access. So in response to my local board, my question is, once if we get those areas in the consultation document that people would like them to be restricted, they can then be added. It's possible for them to be added after the consultation. God, I hope that's...
Yep. Katarina, have you got an answer on that, please?
Kia ora, yes I do. So there's 2 ways we could do that. We could have a bylaw and then assess other sites to meet the Freedom Camping Act criteria to see whether they could be prohibited or restricted, and make an amendment to the schedules of a bylaw to add them. Or if elected members wanted to do it as part of this round, then we would have to pause the decision-making process once the bylaw panel has deliberated and go through a further round of public consultation. So that would delay bringing in a bylaw.
Can you just confirm, please, your first option, which
So
sounded faster and just as easy?
So it would be
faster and
complete this process as consulted under the current statement of proposal, have a bylaw, and then we would need to assess sites under the Freedom Camping Act and go through an amendment process, which includes public consultation.
Right.
Okay.
So your answer is really yes, it can happen
But all of it requires public consultation.
after this consultation. Right, okay. My second question is, noting the legal decision in Tasman and the fact that Tauranga Council have remained unchallenged legally on restrictions for wider residential areas, again, does that mean that we can add more sites following this consultation around that?
So in response, many councillors asked this question at the March meeting, particularly around Tauranga, and you'll note the August 2019 resolutions were very much a Tauranga approach. But you received advice from staff, but a lot of it was legally privileged advice that was held in confidence, and legal provided that in March.
Yeah, I suppose, Your Worship, what I'm saying is it's really hard for our community to understand why not, if that legal advice can't be shared. Are you saying because of the legal challenge that we have received in Omaha, we cannot share that information? Is that correct?
Katie, are you on the line about legal privilege?
Kia ora. Yes, Kat, I am online. So through the chair, one thing I would just note, and I can't get into too much detail about detailed legal advice, but what I would just say is that I can't comment on the legality of another council's bylaw, but I would just note that just because something hasn't been legally challenged, that doesn't mean that if it was challenged that it would stand up to that challenge, and staff have provided advice to councillors, including legal advice on the draft bylaw in the form that is proposed for consultation, and council has taken all reasonable steps in ensuring that what is proposed is legally robust for the purpose of going out for public consultation, and that's included seeking an external legal review of the draft bylaw as proposed, and so we are satisfied that what is proposed is legally robust for the purposes of consultation.
Okay, thank you. And my final question is on compliance. I don't think it's appropriate for local boards to have to use their LDI to assist with compliance. So my question is, will we be putting staff in high-risk areas such as Tamaki Drive and other beachfront areas over summer? And has anyone assessed, if this bylaw goes through, how many staff we will need to police that?
Kia ora, Councillor. I'll just ask Adrian from Licensing and Compliance to talk to you about compliance and enforcement.
Kia ora koutou. Just in response to that question, it really depends on the options we look at for enforcement that's in the proposal. So status quo would be limited in what we could do, but obviously looking at some of those other options in terms of a proactive compliance over a summer period, or alternatively looking for the security option and getting a security company to respond to it in the way that we do with noise, again would respond to those particular issues, and a combination of those with some proactive work in particular hotspot areas that emerge as a result of this bylaw may be appropriate.
Thanks, Adrian.
I know, Councillor Simpson, that there's a table in paragraph 46 which
I saw that. Yeah. Thank you. I reserve my right to speak, Your Worship. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with compliance, it's a bit like how long's a piece of string. We can have more and more and more compliance as long as we're prepared to pay for more and more staff, or we can try and find a balance and place them in the appropriate places where the need is greatest. Anyway, Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore. Question.
Thanks,
please.
Mr. Mayor, and thanks for the team for doing this. It seems to have been convoluted and hasn't been made any easier by some of the political interferences. But my simple question is, and thank you very much, Carolina, for the response you gave me via Christine Watson yesterday. So I just want to get this repeated in the public arena. if a local board wants to add an area, although it's not part of this process, what is the process that will be enabled in the future?
So if they want to add an area that is currently a reserve, then that process will be through the Reserves Act, for example, through a reserve management plan. I note that in Franklin they wanted to add reserves, and we've also identified that there is work that staff are planning to undertake with Franklin to do their omnibus reserve management plans, and that should start early in 2022. And so that process will walk them through a way to allow them to change the default under the Reserves Act. For non-reserves, it is the process I explained to Councillor Simpson.
Thanks very much, Caterina, and all strength to your and the team's arms on this work. It's important. Cheers.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Apologies, I just had a tech problem there. To counteract the monotony of COVID, I watched Parliament last night, and I was interested in the Minister of Tourism, Stuart Nash, announcing that the government is going to undertake a major and comprehensive review of freedom camping. Can officers provide any information on this?
Through the chair, we haven't received that information. I'm just checking whether anyone else online from staff has anything else. All I know is we made a submission on the proposal that they had, and we actually haven't heard back from that process, and I haven't seen any other announcements, Councillor Fletcher, but I'll just check. Excuse me, has any other staff heard of these announcements?
I'm sure they're available on Hansard. If you should choose, it was in response to a private member's bill and the commitment by Stuart Nash to actually deal with it comprehensively. So maybe you could check on that and come back to me.
Yes,
through your worship, I do have some information that may be helpful. So yes, we are aware that there's a private member's bill currently before Parliament that would make some limited amendments to the Act, including requiring freedom.
This wasn't the private member's bill. This was in response. This was from the Minister directly. He spoke at length last night.
Oh, apologies.
Saying that while he understood the problems, he didn't support the private member's bill because he was introducing his own legislation.
Thanks, Councillor. You've probably got the most up-to-date information of all if you are one of those small minority of people who were listening to Parliament last night. I think the difficulty is, he has floated that idea before, but obviously we can't hold back to see what the government might or might not do in the future at this point. I think we've just got to get on and do the job with the best information we have. But maybe officers could just see if there's anything through the ministry that would give them some clarity around what the councillor has asked.
Yes,
Your Worship, my second question relates, I know that at the beginning of this meeting that you explained that you turned down a couple of requests or 4 requests from local boards to speak. And I would be interested if the officers could speak to the concerns that have been raised to councillors in the last couple of days from Waiheke and from Waitakere.
Through the chair, the issues that the Waiheke local board resolved, so they were one of the local boards who did not support the statement of proposal. When we were doing the general rule settings, there was a request to staff to look at what pump stations were available on Waiheke. And so staff proposed that in response to that Waiheke be considered a single area. So the general rule settings would apply in terms of a 2-night stay being for the entire island, because they do not have a pump station on the island. So Waiheke Local Board would prefer that the whole of Waiheke Island would be prohibited. and Waitakere is very concerned about freedom camping on roads, and also has some additional sites that they would prefer would be prohibited under the draft bylaw.
Were there any other opportunities to mitigate the concerns that have been raised?
With the timing that we currently have, no.
And following on from Councillor Simpson's request, what will this, by way of people resources and funds, what is this going to entail for council moving forward?
Just a question of clarification, Councillor Fletcher. Do you mean if we go and assess other sites and go through an amendment process to prohibit them?
Yes.
Yes. So last time staff assessed 1,000 sites, and that took 2.5 people, and then 18 months with reporting to local boards and the community on those sites as well. So that's what it took last time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Papakoon.
Thank you, and tēnā koe Kasarana. This is a follow-up to part of what Councillor Fletcher has already asked about Waiheke, but the concerns there went beyond just the fact that there's no dumping station. It's also about the high levels of homelessness, the limited space at kind of the beach esplanades where there's huge numbers of vans can park up and block access to the locals, and then also the issue around the enforcement. And so I just would like, the question is, how has that package of concerns been responded to? That's the first part of my question, and I just have a follow-up, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor Coombs. So staff set out their response in attachment B to the full length of Waiheke's resolutions.
But I guess my point is that the response is just that the dumping issue can be resolved through the two nights in the general rule, but the issues go far wider than that.
Yes, and at this stage we didn't have information to do an island-wide prohibition.
Right. So the follow-up to my question is, if this goes out for consultation as proposed, and the feedback is overwhelmingly against including Waiheke, is that going to be then possible that it can be looked at to restrict totally freedom camping on the island?
That may have to be looked at as a separate process after we had our bylaw.
So there would have to be an interim step of having the bylaw with the 2 nights and then move to another consultation to prohibit freedom camping totally.
Yes, because the Waiheke Island is covered by the general rule, and so it's not a matter on the prohibited or restricted schedules on the draft bylaw. So it is likely that people would need to have a say, and so we would have to undertake additional consultation, just the same as the response was to Councillor Simpson's question.
Yeah. So just to clarify, because I know the local board will be listening in, so what is the reason why we're not consulting through this process to remove Waiheke altogether?
So staff don't consider there was enough evidence under the criteria of the Freedom Camping Act to prohibit the whole island. So that would require a new reassessment and therefore a new public consultation. So every site someone wants to prohibit requires us to assess it under the Freedom Camping Act requirements and to look at the environment, public health, public safety and access impacts.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Mayor, I guess a similar query that's been raised just about the enforcement, the need for funding, so that we can actually have a summer. I mean, this is going to go ahead, and there will be an interim period. Then funding for communications and enforcement is just going to have to be essential. And I guess my plea too that this can be looked at, that we will have another go at being able to consult on removing Waiheke if that looks like it's necessary after the next summer, and based on the feedback that's going to come through, that it's a genuine feedback to this have your say.
Okay, it looks like it's going to be a two-phase process, but what staff have been trying to do here, I know it's really frustrating for people that feel strongly about particular issues, but they have made an assessment. I take it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Katarina, as to whether this fits within the law or it doesn't, because what we don't want to do is pass a bylaw that is then challenged and overturned. That makes us look incompetent. But is there anything else on the compliance costs? Adrian, I think you addressed this question earlier, that you can add to Councillor Coombs' question.
Yes, Your Worship. I think it's an unknown quantity, as you said before. How long's a piece of string in terms of what enforcement will be required? Obviously, this bylaw is a bit more permissive in relation to previous bylaws that we've had. So we don't really know what we're going to face in terms of non-compliance, whether that be on Waiheke or anywhere else. The ability to issue an infringement gives us an extra tool. Previously, we haven't had that. And as a deterrent effect, the actual infringement does work quite well, particularly in other areas. So, yes, we'll have the ability to go there and address hotspots, but it will depend on the enforcement option that's chosen in relation to it. The same as with noise. If we went for the security option, Waiheke would still have the ability to have that as part of their enforcement over there.
Yeah, that infringement fine power now was regarded as one of the two major changes when we came to examine this earlier in governing body, as I recall it. So thank you very much for that. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you. I think it's probably just on the back of the other questions, because everybody's got communications from several local boards. So just around the Waitakere requests, I just want to be clear on the answer from you, Katarina. I'm pretty sure what you said was, if those extra sites were added in that were under the local reserves under the local government, or roads, they would have to be assessed for the, I think it's the 4 impacts under the Freedom Camping Act, and then it would have to go through a whole process back to the local boards, etc., before it could be put into this, and it would take a long time, and we would be out of time before the old legacy bylaws that govern bits of this would lapse.
Yes, just to clarify, it would be very difficult to do 2 rounds of consultation on this draft bylaw and meet the timing we have for the bylaw to lapse and to undertake the implementation planning to implement it before a new bylaw came into force. So,
okay, it's not a no over time. It's just at the moment there's too many constraints.
Yes, at the moment we are quite constrained. However, the restrictions that we're allowed to do quite broadly, that is what the general rule is. Everything else requires quite specific assessment.
So that means that in the areas that people are concerned about, the maximum time would only be 2 days anyway.
Well, that's just the preferred settings you are consulting on.
Yes, I mean, that's a proposal, yes. Okay.
Proposal, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Al Filipaina.
It's okay now, Worship. Councillor Simpson asked my question in regards to what can happen or what the process is around including it after we've done this. Thank you.
Yep. I think it's important to remember that what we decide in this round, in order to get a bylaw in a timely way, isn't carved in stone. It can be changed over time. And will need to be judged against either the current law or whatever new law the Minister might put in place at some time in the future.
Sorry, Your Worship, based on just what you said, I have now got a question. My humble apologies.
I should have shut up. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sorry. So, tēnā koe Katarina. Look, I just, the question now, based on what His Worship said, is that the bylaw is done and dusted. And I know that Councillors Simpson and also Deputy Mayor asked about inclusion of other areas in that of the Local Government Act or properties or land under there. So once the bylaw's in place, our local boards and community can end up including some areas, but it has to be based on evidence and issues that have come up and a visit to the site. Am I correct in that?
Tēnā koe, Councillor Filipainga. So if governing body adopts a draft bylaw before the others lapse, staff could come back to the regulatory committee and propose a work program. So you'd know what the resources are and the timing was to do new assessments and considerations rather than ad hoc, because it is quite hard to deal with lots of individual requests, and would be able to identify the timing and the staff resource required to run an assessment and amendment process. It would be quite unusual to immediately start that after a bylaw's just been made, but we can come back with a scope to the regulatory committee to set out options for how that process could run.
Ngā thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Councillor Richard Hills.
Kia ora, Chair. I was going to ask about the 2022, but that's quite a good answer, the fact that we have to do this because everything else lapses, so that's good. The other question I had was Chair John Gillan from Kaipātiki has said some of the prohibited things they put forward are not included in the bylaw. Was there a reason, or is that missed off?
Just a question of clarification, Councillor. Yes. Is that in terms of the resolutions they made in August?
Yes.
So that would also, the staff response to that would be identified in attachment B, but generally I would say it's the same response I gave to Councillor Simpson and Councillor Coons, in that we need to do assessments and then go through another public consultation process. So it's kind of the same answer I gave to Councillor Filipainga. Once we have a bylaw, then we can bring back a scope for everyone to look at in terms of assessing and doing amendment processes.
Thank you. The other thing they asked in a high level, and I agree with, is there any ability for us to add in this stage around sort of car parks outside town centres and dairies that are included in the road corridor? I realise the ones that say like hour parking or 90 minutes would be included under transport laws because they would be parked there longer than those. But unrestricted times outside, dairies and takeaways and stuff, could they be included as somewhere that wouldn't allow freedom camping, or would that have to come through the consultation process?
So at the moment, for all roads that don't already have an existing parking restriction under an Auckland Transport or Council traffic bylaw, it's the general rule that is proposed to restrict freedom camping to be self-contained, maximum of 2 nights, leave by 9 AM and a non-return period of 2 weeks. It is those restrictions that will manage all those other areas. If, when we come back with a scope, one of the things we can look at is particular roads which we have evidence of experiencing real problems. And so sometimes you can also do additional restrictions for specific roads or road corridors where we can walk through the Freedom Camping Act criteria and show that what the impacts are.
Okay, so we legally at the moment couldn't put catch-all outside all,
Well, that's what the general rule is.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm talking about, say, the angle parks outside a dairy, hairdresser and takeaways that technically you could park there for 2 days with your camper van.
Yes, unless an Auckland Council traffic bylaw or Auckland Transport traffic bylaw put in parking restrictions for, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, or whatever it may be.
Yeah. And there was another question from the board, but I think that would be also covered. They said that slip roads could block driveways, but that would be already included under Auckland Transport's parking bylaws, wouldn't it? Parking bylaws.
Yes, it would, as are things like parking on grass berms.
Thank you. And what could you just give me an idea of, people can park at the moment on the street, Freedom Camping, can't they? So we're not going to see proliferation overnight suddenly because of this bylaw.
I think it is difficult to say.
Yeah.
I think Adrian from Compliance Enforcement has kind of outlined that we'll have to just wait and see. But yes, you are right. There are no real restrictions on that right now.
Yeah, and because of our graduated approach to enforcement all the time, even with the general rule of 2 nights, would it be right in saying things like rubbish and noise and antisocial behaviour would, if they were causing a nuisance, would already be covered even with the general rule being 2 nights? If someone was creating all the problems that people complain about with freedom camping, those would probably be able to be managed over and above the general rule.
Yes, they should be able to be managed above the general rule, but I'll just ask Adrian to give you a response.
Yeah, they would be dealt with under their own legislation, whether it be littering or whatever. But again, under the Freedom Camping Act, there is in relation to rubbish and disposal of rubbish that's mentioned there. So they could be subject to an infringement, even if it was only for 1 night and they were disposing of rubbish inappropriately.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving at this stage because I've got 5 more questions. It's 3:20 and we've got 10 more items after this. So the next question is in the name of Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I coming through okay there?
Yep, loud and clear.
Thank you, sir. I've got 3 questions. I wasn't clear on Mr. Watson's or Councillor Watson's recommendation. Was he trying to get a change from 2 days to 1 day?
Yeah. The recommendation was to amend the statement of proposal on the general rules section to allow freedom campers to stay a maximum of 1 night only in the same road or off-road parking area. Right. And the legal advice, the advice I've got from our legal team is that because we moved that recommendation at the previous GB. There has to be a report before there is an amendment to a decision we've already made under Standing Order Section 1.9.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for clarifying that. I probably would have seconded that because of the community that I'm listening to in Tamaki Drive and Omaha and other areas probably would have endorsed that. So I'll just stay open-minded on that around a potential judicial review, sir. My next question probably is around, is the consequence of what we're proposing is that campers in a self-contained stickered van can live on the streets of the suburb indefinitely? So in other words, are they entitled to park on the street or a car park for, 3 days or 2 nights before having to move, and then they can just move to a street around the corner? So there's probably 2 components to that, just to clarify that. Can they park in a suburb indefinitely by moving around different streets? I.e. they can just move a couple of streets away and then come back to another one in 14 days.
Okay, let's get a reply on that. I think they can do that right now, of course. And without this bylaw, they'll be able to do it forever. This bylaw will be a constraint, but they can keep moving, I think. But let's get a formal reply from officers.
You are correct, Mr. Mayor. The Freedom Camping Act allows freedom camping free of restrictions, and this bylaw is proposing restrictions on specific sites and through the general rule by minimising the amount of time you're allowed to stay and your return period and the leave time. So this bylaw is in fact imposing restrictions that do not currently exist with the permissive nature of the Freedom Camping Act once the legacy bylaws lapse in October 2022.
I think where some confusion may exist is councils like Whangarei, Tauranga, Gisborne actually seem to have those bylaws in, Mr. Mayor, and are more restrictive than what we're proposing. So I think that's where the confusion exists. So the question is that correct, and how can that be changed during this proposal that we're about to go out for? In other words, are we open-minded to changing that, realising, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, if other councils are actually more restrictive than what we're proposing?
Get a line up.
So governing body is open-minded on the settings for the general rule, which is why the full range of options, including a one-night stay, have been included in the statement of proposal, so the public can fully choose settings that they prefer. So that does demonstrate governing body's open-mindedness around the settings for a general rule. And I think Katie already answered the question around what other councils do and what advice we've been given about what we can do, but she could restate that, Katie.
Thanks, Katarina. So, yeah, just to repeat my earlier comment, the governing body has been provided with advice on what it is able to do under the legislative scheme of the Freedom Camping Act, and we have taken all reasonable steps to ensure that what we are proposing for public consultation is legally robust. And just because another council has a draft bylaw has a bylaw that hasn't been legally challenged, doesn't necessarily mean that if there was a legal challenge to another council's bylaw, that bylaw would withstand that challenge. So Auckland Council needs to consider the advice that it has been given in making decisions for its bylaw.
Okay, but potentially we could prohibit in front of residential and commercial properties that get identified in the feedback. Is that right, Katie?
Just to clarify that the August 29 resolutions actually made resolutions very similar to that, and you received advice from staff and from legal and decided not to proceed with those August 2019 resolutions.
I think we've moved on.
Yeah, I think you'd need to go back and look at that advice. Can I just add one thing? We've got to be careful we don't start making laws about things that generally don't happen. If you're going to be freedom camping, you're very unlikely to want to camp in a place where people are walking by to go into a shop right next to you. So, potentially it could be a problem. But in reality, it may not have been a problem. But just to highlight one other point, I mean, that one-night stay rule, just to make it absolutely clear, while we're putting up 2 nights for consultation, the one-night stay could be an alternative option because people can comment and say, no, we think it should be 1 night or 3 nights. So they do have that option of expressing their views in the consultation anyway.
I think that's, and Mr. Chair, I think that's a very good change in direction that's there. I'd be interested to see what the public say about that.
Okay, look, I really do want to move on because people keep putting more questions in the question bar, and we won't be finished till 7 o'clock tonight. So let's try and move it along. Councillor Wayne Walker, next question, please.
Sure. So just a question further to the one that Greg was discussing. And that is that given that it is possible for people to submit on, for example, a maximum of 1 night, can we indicate in what we go out for consultation that options like that exist? Is that possible?
Through the chair, Councillor Walker, that is included in the statement of proposal. I'm just checking what page that's on. I think it's page 187, where we set out the full list of options for that maximum stay rule.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Thank you. Can you please advise us in terms of the environmental assessments, especially within the Waitakere Ranges, that we have really considered this adequately, particularly where there are non-curved roadways, and that there are no risks in terms of the transfer of Kari dieback?
Through the chair, we have not assessed every site in Auckland. The list of sites that are prohibited and restricted that are currently attached to the bylaw have been through assessment, they've been through public consultation previously, and bylaw panel deliberations. So I can't confirm that everything, that all of that would exactly have been covered. So we did only assess 1,000 sites last time, and council has over 4,000 parks and open spaces. So we did originally look to assess those areas which had car parking already. But what I can confirm is that all reserves are of course still managed under the Reserves Act, and when staff have gone through to do the Omnibus Reserve Management Act processes, they're identifying that 97% of the land in those areas that council holds has been reserves. And that's a roundabout way of answering.
Yeah, it doesn't fill me. I'm just aware of what a huge amount of investment we've put into Kari dieback, and I would have liked to have had a wee bit more confidence on that.
Sorry, Councillor Fletcher, and of course regional parks are not part of this bylaw as well. So particularly in the Waitakere Ranges, because of the complex way that the regional parkland is held, because of the specific acts out there, all of those will be managed under their current reserve management plans.
Okay, and that should, it's prohibited under the Reserves Act to park in that area then? Unless
they've allowed for pay for camping.
Okay.
So it's already been provided in the reserve management plan. So you'll see in the statement of proposal that regional parks are excluded, and then that enforcement is backed up by the Public Safety and Nuisance bylaw.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Josephine Bartley.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Katarina. I just wanted you to confirm that local boards have had the opportunity to submit on this, because I'm wondering why the last minute emails coming through from certain boards. And yeah, I am noting the boards that are like raising their issues through their councillors on this issue, and there's other boards that aren't raising any issues. It's quite obvious. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartley. The process that staff have followed follows the agreed processes and principles for local board input into regional policies that was adopted by the council. So that was around where we have options such as the general rule. There was a joint working party of councillors and local board members who considered that, and of course in accordance with those processes and principles we sent the draft statement of proposal to the local boards. That is the process we follow under that adopted guideline for all bylaws.
Yep, so there's been a lot of opportunity for consultation. Shane Henderson, next question, please. Shane, have you got your mic on, or have you gone for a coffee? I'll come back to Shane. Desley Simpson, you had another question.
Thanks, Your Worship. Look, I just wondered, with your indulgence and potentially the mover and the seconder, having another resolution that notes, should extra prohibited or restricted sites come from consultation, these will be discussed and can be assessed and consulted on, and you can add with an insert period or just consulted on. I think that will give local boards a bit of assurance that the consultation is step one. Would that work?
Well, I'll get a comment from Katarina first, and then I'd need you to send it through to Sandra. Katarina?
You may need to add in the future once we have a bylaw, or could be considered as part of future amendments to a bylaw.
I think what they're trying to, what I'm hearing is they want it done pretty quickly. So what sort of time frame would that be, Katarina?
So I am feeling very nervous to have a bylaw if we go through a double assessment and consultation process before the October legacy bylaws lapse. If we do that before we have a bylaw made under the Freedom Camping Act, we might not make it, and therefore you will have nothing but the Freedom Camping Act. So that is the risk if we do that before we have a bylaw in place.
So give me a time frame.
So we need all our resources on getting this bylaw in place, and then on implementation, planning and implementation. So I did answer to Councillor Filipainga that once that has occurred, then we could do a scope to identify the resources and the timeframes to deliver that. But we have all our staff for this are on this, doing this process right now.
Yep. Look, at a certain point, we've been doing this for bloody 3 years now. We've got to get a bylaw in place, but that bylaw isn't there forever. But if we keep amending and changing and chopping around, we'll end up with no bylaw in place and then no controls. So I think, people are going to say, well, we had a crack at it this time, let's put it in place, and then if there are holes in it and if there's a change in the legislation, we can have a go again. Doing is putting back the time when we actually get this bylaw up and in place, or we'll end up with.
I suppose my question is, Your Worship, what's the point of consultation if we cannot add or take away sites? You've got to listen to the people. And my purpose of my amendment was just to make sure that that is really clear.
Okay, can we get a comment on that, Katarina?
So this statement of proposal is consulting on the 45 proposed for prohibition, the 22 restricted, and the general rule. That is what it is consulting on. That we haven't made resolutions to consult on other things.
I think at a certain point we've just got to make a decision. This has been going a long time, and we've got to make a decision to get the thing done and completed, and then let people know. We'll be monitoring it closely, and if there are problems that are real problems, we'll look at it again. But I think we've heard all the arguments, folks. So let's come back. Shane, you're having internet problems rather than coffee problems. You're with us at the moment.
I wish it was coffee problems, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I'm glad you can hear me. So we've talked and we've heard staff responses around if there are problems with a site, we'll look at it again. So I'm familiar with the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act and how you prove that there are problems with a park to make it a liquor ban park. What would one need to do to prove for a specific site to be prohibited outside of the general rule? So, for example, Piha car park is not covered. How would one go about making that covered as a prohibited site? What are the problems?
Tēnā koe, Councillor. So the Freedom Camping Act is very similar to the Supply and Sale of Liquor Act. Both of them at their base go, these things are permitted, and here are the criteria and the evidence thresholds you have to meet to do anything other than make it permitted. And so the Freedom Camping Act is the same. So generally the same assessment for the general rules has to be undertaken for an area to be prohibited. So one of those things is around complaints and enforcement data, and so evidence around that. And then we try to assess what the impacts are in terms of the Act. So it says we can look at environment impacts, public health impacts, public safety impacts, and access impacts.
Thanks, it's very helpful. Just a supplementary, what would be the method of going down that path? So does that go through a local board? Does it come to the GB? How would you initiate something like that?
Because it will be very difficult to manage resource for lots of ad hoc requests over time, I think it's still the process that I proposed to Councillor Filipainga, which is once we have a bylaw in place, we can come back to the regulatory committee to scope up how a process of assessment and amendments to the bylaw, so that we were able to be really clear about that process. And that could even include how that will be monitored and kept up to date. But it is difficult when we get lots of independent little assess this, because the bylaw process would go through another full process like this one, but with the new sites.
Okay, I can understand that. Thank you. Reserve my right to speak. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, Desley, are you wanting to proceed with that amendment? Because I would need to...
Yeah, I'm just putting it in the sidebar. I'm just getting it done now.
Okay.
Hold on.
To answer Greg's comment, Councillor Watts ruled out understanding orders, so that's not a case of seconding that. But I want to see what Desley wants to put up. I want to comment from officers on what the implications of passing that would be, and then at that point we'll move into debate, and we'll debate the amendment first. Okay, so I'm reading, should additional prohibited or restricted sites come from consultation, these will be discussed and can be assessed and consulting on following adoption of the bylaw. Now, if I recall rightly, Katarina's point was, yes, but that would probably be after the bylaw was in place. And that, if that were the case, Katarina, you were comfortable with the amendment, but I get you to speak on it.
Just from your, sorry, I'm not very good at multitasking. So just from your reading of it, it sounds like Councillor Simpson put in there after the bylaw. So that would meet that requirement. And that would also make sure that staff came back to elected members, to the appropriate committee with that process of how would we do that.
Okay, so you're comfortable with that. And
do you want me to talk to it, Your Worship?
Well, if
Sorry.
we've probably had a discussion. I'll just read it again to Katarina because I want to make sure it doesn't hold up what we're trying to do and get this bylaw in place. Should additional prohibited or restrictive sites come from consultation, these will be discussed and can be assessed and consulted on following the adoption of the bylaw. So, Katarina, you were comfortable with that?
Yes.
And then I'll now ask whether Linda Cooper and Angela Dalton are comfortable with that as the mover and the seconder of the recommendations being adopted.
Mr. Mayor, I understand the intention, but this is not regional thinking, and that's what is difficult here. I would, if this was adopted, I would rather see it saying as an omnibus piece of work, because what I'm very worried about as the chair of regulatory, and I may not be that next time, I may not even be here. However, I know how big our work plan is and how restricted we are. We already lost a staff member after the last debacle of this freedom camping. I don't want to lose any more because of the way we manage this. If we're going to do this, it has to be reviewed after, say, a year or two, get a couple of seasons under our belt, then put it together into a body of work. I liken it to the whole tree protection plan change. We said we haven't got the resources to do tree by tree. We have to get a whole bunch together. So I could support that as going in there if it said, after a year or a 2-year review, because as we've seen, this is not about what might happen. Everybody's acting as if this could happen. It's got to be evidence-based. So you've got to collect evidence, and you can't just do it on one thing. So what scares me about this amendment as it stands is that it could have the regulatory committee forcing staff to run off to do one thing, a whole bylaw change for one site, and I'm not prepared to support that. But if Councillor Simpson was happy to say, after a year review or a 2-year review, so 2 seasons, I would support that, because I think then we'd get enough evidence to do a bunch together, and it'd be worth our resources then.
I understand that, and I think the implications of what you're saying is how it would probably happen in practice.
Mr. Chair, we've got people debating in the sidebar. Councillor Stewart saying 6 months. That's just not enough time. That's one summer.
Yeah.
I've got an amendment. Can I talk to it before you start debating?
Please, Councillor Simpson.
Thank you. I'm going to put this up as an amendment, and I'm seeking a seconder, and I believe I have that in. I've got a couple of people, actually. I can't read the sidebar, but I've got Councillor Sayers, Councillor Fletcher. The reason I say that, we're going out for consultation with a set of restricted and prohibitive, sites. Fine, I get that. But the whole purpose of consultation is to hear from the people of Auckland. And if they come back strongly with a list of sites, I think we have to listen to them. And I think what the whole purpose of this amendment is not waiting 2 years to look at them again, is to give Aucklanders confidence that although we're going out with one lot, if there's something that we've missed, we're prepared to look at it. And if you have large volumes talking about certain things, we should be able to do that. So if the mover and the seconder do not wish
we were in questions, and now I've tried to see whether the mover wanted to adopt it, and she says no, not in that form. You say you want to press ahead with it, so I'm accepting that, and it will be moved as an amendment by you, seconded by
Councillor Sayers.
And then now that we can move to commentary. If we've finished the questions, we'll move to commentary. And we are now in that session, and I'll now ask you to speak to your amendment.
Do you want to start all over again?
Take it as read that we've heard what you've said already.
Well, you've heard what I've said, but I feel very strongly. Very strongly, if you go out and consult on this very contentious topic, and there is a large sway of people that either wish to do what Waiheke wants to do, or add additional sites, for example, like that they'll probably do in Orake, you have to give them confidence that you will listen and act on that. And that's what is the purpose of my amendment. And I'm not prepared to wait 2 years for that. I think it should be done quite quickly after the adoption of the bylaw. There we go. I'm happy to keep talking, but I thought I'd done it quite briefly.
Mike, Phil.
Sorry, I was muted. So we have the amendment now. We are in comments, and I'm asking for those that wish to speak to the amendment to take the call now. So I'm not sure who wants to speak to the amendment, so please, if you could just indicate if you want to speak to the amendment, we'll deal with that first. Councillor Sayers is the seconder. Do you wish to speak to the amendment?
I think Daniel did. I couldn't.
Oh, Daniel, sorry, I'm lost in the sidebar here. Daniel, you want to speak to the amendment?
I mean, I have some sympathy for what Councillor Cooper has raised, Your Worship, but the point being that consultation is an opportunity to identify not only feedback on what is proposed, but if there are other sites that are identified through the consultation period, then they will have to be considered. I would assume that Councillor Simpson will understand and Councillor Sayers will understand that they can only be realistically considered if there is evidence so as to meet the threshold for those sites to be considered for restriction or prohibition, or for restricted sites to be reclassified as prohibited, if that's the purpose of it. So I assume that understanding that that will be the test for individual sites that are identified through the consultation period, then it would seem to me that that's reasonable. But I would have thought it would be a very difficult exercise to be able to meet the evidence threshold if there hasn't been probably at least 2 or 3 seasons of freedom camping at those locations, so that we have an evidential basis for consideration of the matter. And so I'll just leave that with the mover and seconder of the amendment to explain to this group of people how you can obtain the evidence to justify that beyond consideration, beyond it just being identified through feedback, because if there's no evidence to support it, it can't proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. We now have a comment from Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, Chair. And I think that's very appropriate from my wise colleague, Councillor Newman, and we need to have that evidence. So if that takes a few months, 6 months, 3 months, whatever it might be, I think we should be open to that. I don't think the amendment prohibits that. And I guess, Your Worship, I'm just speaking support, but also support the thinking of my colleague, and I hope he supports this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Al-Filipina.
Thank you, Your Worship, and sorry for using this, and I hope you can hear us.
I can hear you clearly. Thank you. Okay,
look, Your Worship, I put in the sidebar. I just needed some questions of clarification, but if we can't do that as a result of starting the discussion, I'll then just leave it in the comments. So is there room for 2 questions of clarification, Your Worship?
You could ask the mover of the amendment, but the staff, because we're now in commentary, are now no longer part of the debate. What we know from staff is that they were, from Katarina, that she was happy with that amendment, providing it contained following the adoption of the law, so it wasn't holding up the initial bylaw. The question of the time that might be taken is something that will be determined in the future and not here. So, Alf, if you've got any questions to Desley, please ask.
I'll include in my comments, because Your Worship, I won't be supporting this, and the reason I won't be supporting the amendment is as a result of, I have no doubt at all that the local boards and the community have been aware that you can, once the bylaw is passed, that there will be an opportunity based on evidence to end up including places like the ones that Councillor Desley Simpson has said, but also those that are mentioned in some of the emails that we have received. For example, lands and reserves and parks under the Local Government Act, which is currently not in there. So this is, as Councillor Henderson said earlier, very similar to when I was on the Regulatory Committee for the first 2 terms of this council, and when we were talking about the bylaws and the fact that we had to relook at all our bylaws, and this is the one around alcohol in parks, and we had to get the police, the community involved to give evidence that the alcohol ban needed to stay where they currently are. So look, that process, I have no doubt at all, was explained. The other issue, I think, for me is people are talking about 6 months, 8 months, whatever it takes. I'm sure Katarina said when we were discussing the substantive that they did some work on the sites. I think it was 1,000 she mentioned, and it took 18 months to staff, and it took 18 months. So that is the time, and this is why I'm supporting the comments from Councillor Cooper. That it is, and I think if that's the case, we need to be straight up with our community if that is the advice that we're getting from our staff. So Your Worship, based on what I've heard the commentary from our staff and also Councillor Cooper, I will not be supporting the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. We've now got Councillor Shane Henderson speaking to the amendment.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. It's a bit weird to take a call to speak when I'm not decided by it, but I am not decided. And I guess what I want to get clear in my mind is that I was of the belief this was going to happen anyway. Unless I've taken staff's advice the wrong way, that we would come back and assess it later on individual sites and look at not just what the public feedback is, but also what damage there is in those sites, like you would Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act stuff. So I thought it was happening anyway. Look, I'm leaning towards supporting it, but I'll take the views of my colleagues and think about them in the time that I have.
Support it, Shane.
Yeah, thanks. I'm done.
I agree.
Microphone if you're trying to use it. Mayor Goff, you there?
Sorry, my screen just disappeared and I had to get it back again. Yes, thanks, Shane. Councillor Richard Hills.
Yeah, just brief comment. I don't actually think the amendment really makes sense the way it's restricted sites that come from consultation. I understand what it means, but I don't really get it. But I will support it because it's actually what the officers said anyway. It's exactly what the officers said. So I'm not super understanding what the intent is, but I'm not willing to vote against it because it will be used politically to say we're against consultation. But yeah, basically that's what the officers have already said, that if there is evidence, if there are things that come up, it will at a later date be consulted on, and as has been mentioned by others, that is based on time and staff and money and everything else. So I hope we just move on from this item now, because this has been a very long time and all the legalities have been spelled out to us and everything else. So yeah, I'll be supporting it because it's already what the staff said.
Thank you. You've expressed my sentiments exactly. Councillor John Watson.
Yes. So similarly, the officer indicated there's no problem with this. So I think in any consultation, you should leave yourself open to, to addressing perhaps the unexpected or something that's compelling. We can't prejudge what that may or may not be. So I don't think there's any harm done in including this, and quite the reverse. It sort of signals, a degree of good faith in the consultation process and this kind of evolving proposal, which has, I think, ended up in a better, a better potential outcome than when we started. So why wouldn't you support it in those circumstances?
Thank you very much. Now, Councillor Newman has come up with a slight change of words. Councillor Simpson, would you be happy to adopt those words?
I think so, because they have to happen anyway. You can't just add a site without it being, sorry, and I was writing this on the hub. No one was giving me any.
No, that's fine. So we add into that which are supported by evidence. And I think if you're happy with that, we'll just make that part of the amendment. If we can, yep, it's already up there. Okay, look, I'll just make a very brief comment.
I endorse that, Phil.
Yep, no, that's good. Happy the seconder is happy with it. Look, I think we've heard from our officers that provided this doesn't hold up this bylaw, this is what would normally happen in the normal course of events. Obviously, you need enough time for the thing to settle in before you can do it, and it will take that time anyway. But that, from my point of view, this gives some people a little bit of political cover, and it doesn't do any harm, and I'm therefore happy to support it. So I'm going to put the amendment on the voices first of all, unless somebody's calling for a division. So all those in favour of the amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? I declare the amendment carried. We now come to the substantive amendment, with that amendment now part of the overall recommendations. Are there any comments on the overall amendment? Just conscious of time and moving this one along. Everybody happy for me to put the major thing?
Mr. Mayor, Councillor Watson here. I just want to make a brief comment if that's possible.
Councillor Watson.
Yeah, and it will be brief. It's just really to clarify the amendment that I had been planning to put up, and that would basically go to altering the setting in the general rule from 2 nights to 1 night. But the officers are correct. They have actually done a very good and a very fair job of outlining that option in the proposal. They say we want your views on possible alternative settings for the general rule, and in respect of that 1 day general rule, in fact, do say that this would encourage responsible camping behaviour and help manage potential impacts of longer stays. So I guess my reason for putting forward the amendment was obviously in any proposal such as this is to make that, in effect what you're consulting on. It's not excluded by the nature of the commentary the officers have provided. So I just hope that people will pick that up, because going forward, certainly in terms of the parking on street, it's very clear to me that, and clear to the local boards too, I might add, in their feedback, that we're opening up a potential raft of compliance-related issues, not least of which will be resourcing and financing it, whereas such a general rule, I think, would not only be more acceptable to the general populace, but I think it would make it a lot clearer what can and cannot be done, and therefore the enforcement might follow. But of course, that'll be up to the public to decide now. And just finally, Mr. Mayor, in terms of moving this forward, and I know this isn't really appropriate today, but I think we do have other possibilities that we can put up, not from the bylaw people, but from other parts of council, where there are ways of accommodating freedom camping, perhaps not quite so free, maybe a little pay might help, where it's currently working well now. And I think of some of our regional parks that have a fantastic setting and are providing that service to these sorts of campers. And to me, that's a far more sustainable long-term solution, safer for the people, and a better place for people to be camping rather than on sides of roads. But I'll save that for another day. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. I now have to move a procedural resolution because it's 4 o'clock, and I move that we continue the meeting of the governing body till the closure of business. Have I got a seconder for that, please?
Simpson.
Desley Simpson. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary,
aye.
To the contrary, carried. If there's no other general comments, I'm going to take Linda Cooper to close the debate, and then, as Councillor Kuma's requested, a 2-minute break before we recommence our business. So, Councillor Linda Cooper, in reply, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to pass on huge thanks to our policy bylaw staff. They've done a huge amount of work based on the previous work over 2018-19, and they've had to have immense patience. They've gathered a lot of information. They've been to the local boards, and we also workshopped the general rules where we all agreed that 2 days was to go forward. But it's good to see that there's other options, and of course, as the panel will always consider other options. I do need to, it was interesting what you said there, Mayor, about that amendment, that it provided good political cover. And that's a bit telling, really. But I won't say anything more about that. And my comments were in no way meant that I did not want to have public consultation. I'm doing this all the time. But what we are actually consulting on is this proposal. And so that's what's important, to get the feedback, and we do gather other information that may not be quite within the scope, and we do bundle that together and act on those parts of it. My biggest fear around the last part of the resolution was that there could be political pressure from maybe one area put on our staff to go ahead with that new piece of work before they were ready, before they had evidence, and not giving us long enough time and to be able to fit in the current work program. So, you know, and we've seen that before, and I don't think that's good decision making. So I hope that the good faith is there, that people give it a chance. We don't have a lot of choice. I think Councillor Watson said, oh, it's better for people to be camping and paying a bit. Well, that goes against the intent of the law. The law says there's freedom camping, whether we like it or not. And this proposed bylaw gives us an option to be able to control as much as we can within a permissive framework. And I really do hope that it's supported when it comes back, so that we do have something in place before summer, so that we can test it, and then we've got something in place before the other legacy bylaws lapse, because then it would really be a free-for-all. So thank you to everybody for the robust discussion.
Thanks, Councillor Cooper, and I think the point's well made. So you'll see that there was an amendment to nominate Linda Cooper as chair and Councillor Angela Dalton as a panel member, and an independent Maori statutory board member to be determined by the IMSB, likely to be Glenn Wilcox. So just draw that to Councillors' attention. So I will put the recommendation as a whole, and I'll put it on the voices. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
So contrary, no. I declare that carried, and we'll just adjourn this meeting for, I'll give you 5 minutes actually, at 4:10, and hopefully we can complete the rest of the agenda in a reasonably timely way. Okay, thank you very much. Back at 4:10, please.